So I just wanted to start with the broader picture. Australia as a general proposition supports openness to trade and investment as a means for securing our prosperity. In the 2017 Foreign Policy White Paper, we identified a stable and prosperous Indo-Pacific region as Australia's most important long-term foreign policy objective. And in pursuit of that ambition, one of our long-term goals is to bring together the major Indo-Pacific economies under one set of trade and investment rules. Now, I've got a slide here. I don't know if...
It's up there.
Oh, it's up there.
Yeah.
As you can see from the slide, we already have free trade agreements across the region, including with each RCEP signatory either bilaterally or through our FTA with ASEAN and New Zealand. And we also have agreements with some RCEP signatories through the CPTPP. India remains the only major regional country with which we haven't yet signed an FTA. From our perspective, these agreements coexist with each other and are not mutually exclusive. They all build on and are consistent with commitments in the WTO. Ultimately, what we're seeking this range of agreements is to establish arrangements that maximize tariff reductions, open up services markets, and set rules to enhance trade and investment and reduce regulatory risk. FTAs like our bilateral FTA with the United States or the CPTPP are our gold standard. They include comprehensive commitments on trading services and investment, as well as goods, and are designed to address non-tariff barriers and other behind-the-border measures that could impede trade. Now, for RCEP, given the breadth and divergent levels of economic development of its membership, the RCEP agreement is more modest. Nevertheless, the coverage of the agreement is wide. It encompasses common rules for the application of reduced tariffs, trade facilitation, intellectual property, electronic commerce, competition policy, SMEs, and government procurement. It also contains commitments on tariff reductions and eliminations made by each participant to each or all of the other participants, and commitments on market access for services providers by each participant to all other participants. In the case of China, for example, while we do not gain tariff reductions beyond our existing bilateral FTA, there are some improvements to market access for our service providers that I've listed on the next slide. They reflect updates to China's investment regime since the signature of the China-Australia Free Trade Agreement and investment commitments made on a negative list basis, which capture much of China's domestic liberalisation in recent years. Such commitments in services and investment provide new transparency and constrain future withdrawal of access to the Chinese market. RCEP parties also commit to providing treatment as favourable as that given to through later agreements to other foreign investors. For instance, while we don't know the exact coverage of the CAI between the EU and China, it is possible that treatment given to EU investors under the recently signed investment agreement could be conferred under this MFN commitment to Australian investors. The bigger gains to RCEP, however, are the support the agreement provides for common regional rules around trade, including providing one set of rules for businesses trading in multiple regional countries, which will reduce the compliance burden of rules of origin for exporters, and simplified access to preferential tariffs for companies participating in regional value chains. Or put simply, products that move across multiple borders in the process of production. To elaborate a bit, trade agreements typically include rules of origin to ensure producers in other countries cannot free ride off the deal by shipping product produced in a third country through one of the parties to the agreement. For RCEP, the rules of origin allow companies to use the contribution to the value of a product from all countries participating in the deal to determine whether preferential tariffs apply, rather than simply the value generated in one country under a bilateral agreement. RCEP's e-commerce chapter also improves upon the chapter China-Australia Free Trade Agreement provisions. The agreement also has a range of cooperative mechanisms, including technical assistance and annual ministerial and officials consultations. These forums provide valuable mechanisms to check in with other parties and raise issues arising in the implementation of the agreement. RCEP will enter into force 60 days after at least 6 ASEAN member states and 3 non-ASEAN member states have ratified the agreement. We, as Australia, are working towards ratification by late 2021. It requires Australian domestic treaty-making procedures, including tabling in Parliament, consideration by the Joint Standing Committee on Treaties, the passage of enabling legislation, and approval and ratification by the Executive Council. A copy of the text and a range of fact sheets which elaborate on various elements of the deal are available on the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade's website. I have listed where this is available on the slide. I'm more than happy to answer questions at the end about the agreement, but as I said earlier, Nick may have overstated my competency, but if there is a question I don't know an answer to, I'm more than happy to talk to experts in Canberra and get an answer.
Okay, super. Thank you, Kevin. Next we'll hand over to Shiro Armstrong. So Shiro is a research economist and associate professor at the Crawford School of Public Policy at ANU, and he's also a director of the Australia-Japan Research Centre down there. So Shiro, it'd be terrific to get your perspective, and also people, once again, if you've got questions, flick them and we'll get to them in the second half. Over to you, Shiro.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Nick, and thank you, Kevin, for leading off there. Look, I don't have any slides, so I'll try to be as quick as possible and look forward to engaging in the Q&A session. But I think what I'm going to talk about follows on nicely from what Kevin mentioned, and hopefully I think Leonie will give you another business perspective. So I want to talk about 3 things, basically. The first is the importance of RCEP, this agreement, for East Asia and the global trading system. Second thing I want to talk about is managing the China relationship. And the third thing is the economic cooperation agenda. So what I thought in my brief 10 minutes, talking about the importance of RCEP, and I'll follow on a lot from what Kevin said, I want to talk about 2 myths around RCEP. So the first myth, that RCEP is China-led. Now that's often been mentioned, but in the United States, in the popular press. Of course, you get that impression because China is such a large economy and the largest economy in the RCEP grouping. But of course, that's not correct, and it's important to understand this was an agreement conceived in Indonesia that is ASEAN-led. So ASEAN played a central role in the whole agreement, including its conclusion. And that's because it mattered strategically to ASEAN, economically and strategically. It helps ASEAN achieve its ASEAN Economic Community initiative and its single market vision. So what it does really is, by helping the ASEAN integration process with the large economies around ASEAN, the Southeast Asian 10 members, it helps manage ASEAN centrality and the great power rivalry and competition in our region. And if you saw the Economist magazine this last week, a big part of the US-China strategic rivalry, I think, will be ASEAN acting as a buffer, and it will help countries like Australia and others deal with and manage the big power strategic rivalry. So it's important for the ASEAN region, for supply chains, for diversifying trade in our region, and for regional integration. The second myth I wanted to talk about was the low standards in RCEP. So quite often it was said that the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the TPP, had high standards, or platinum standards, some called them, whereas RCEP had much lower standards, given you had Southeast Asia leading, countries like India and China involved. Well, I think TPP, yes, has high standards. In some areas, the standards were too high in intellectual property protections, for example, that would have required really big transfers of wealth from countries like Australia to the United States as importers of intellectual property, and probably didn't get the balance right between consumers and business. But of course, the TPP had data provisions and went much more in a number of areas. I think RCEP was watered down a bit. The commitments were watered down a bit, largely thanks to India, mostly. But I think what's important to understand is Australia, Japan, and many other countries would not have signed on to an agreement like RCEP if it wasn't credible and if the standards weren't high enough. Already, RCEP was larger than the Trans-Pacific Partnership with the United States in economic terms. It's where the dynamism in the global economy is. Take the United States out of TPP and you have CPTPP, it's much smaller than RCEP. So RCEP is important because of its strategic weight, its economic size, but also because it keeps markets open in our region. And that's especially when protectionism is on the rise in the United States, parts of the European Union, United Kingdom, and elsewhere. So when RCEP was signed, I did a bunch of interviews. I was often asked by the press, what's in it for Australia? Australia has free trade agreements with all the other partners except India, as Kevin showed. Well, it brings other countries into rules and agreements and commitments to liberalise and open up their economies to each other. Just have to take Northeast Asia, for example, Japan and China and South Korea. Japan and China are the second and third largest economies in the world, and there is no bilateral agreement that's of any relevance between the two. It's all managed under the World Trade Organization, the WTO. So I think some may still call it a low standard agreement. Australia would not have signed on to a low standard agreement. I think, as Kevin mentioned, I think Leonie will mention, the rules of origin were really important. This goes beyond what was negotiated in the Trans-Pacific Partnership and the US MCA, the NAFTA 2.0, and is really going to do a significant job of expanding global value chains, supply chains in our region. They're much cleaner rules of origin within the membership. So that was the first point, the importance of RCEP. I want to now talk about managing the China relationship. This is in the context of the deterioration in the Australia-China relationship, of course, but more broadly, dealing with a growing China that's economically and politically more assertive. As we all know, that China's unleashed some unilateral trade sanctions on Australia. There's been a breakdown in trust between our two countries. Part of it is due to the trade diversion of the US-China trade agreement, the Phase 1 agreement, where China agreed to buy $200 billion worth of US agricultural produce, but it's also largely geopolitics and the inability of our countries to manage, thus far, the political relationship. So what's Australia to do? Well, not much on our own. We can repair the bilateral relationship, and China can work on that bilaterally too. But I think at the end of the day, we have to think and understand that big powers do what they want. We need to engage the reform elements in the Chinese system and lock the Chinese into multilateral rules. That's where RCEP, I think, is a pretty strong signal internationally of China committing to multilateral rules. Australia deals with China now on the same terms as other countries in the agreement, including Japan, South Korea, Southeast Asia. Now, India, of course, withdrew from the RCEP agreement at the 11th hour. I was worried about competition from East Asia, mainly China, but India is still going to have to deal with the Chinese economy and competition from Chinese companies. So I would have thought it's better to be in a grouping like this where you do deal with China among peers and other like-minded countries. But I'll come back to that. So we did hear mention of the China-EU Comprehensive Agreement on Investment. I think that's another strong sign that the Chinese are willing to sign up to big commitments externally to drive reform at home. That's how China drove reform and locked in reform through the WTO. And China has also, through Xi Jinping, signalled interest in joining the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement. Now, that might be a long way off. Australia and other countries have a veto on China joining this, but I think that could be probably read as a pretty positive signal, because for China to get anywhere near the hurdle, or clearing the hurdle of membership, it'll have to make strong commitments to reform its state-owned enterprise sector. That's going to be a pretty big price to pay for China to join. So I think that's a strong signal of the reform element in the Chinese system. I want to finally end on where RCEP is going to help Australia manage the relationship with China, economic and political relationship, and where there's a lot of gain to be made, and that's the economic cooperation agenda. So this is not a one-off static agreement where we agree to commitments and then it's an implementation schedule with punishment if you don't make it on that schedule, but it's a living agreement. And I think importantly, this is where ASEAN, APEC, for example, have a lot of interactions between officials, and they're criticized often for being a talk fest or a talk shop. This is going to be very important to bring some of the slower countries that are going to be having a tougher time implementing their commitments, bringing them along and narrowing gaps between and within countries. But it's also going to be important for reforming behind the border issues and improving business environments in these countries. It's also going to be important for rulemaking, new rulemaking that's not in the agreement, making progress on digital and data commitments, on investment. We heard about the ratchet up mechanisms as other agreements are signed, as the world changes. There is this need for constant dialogue between officials and ministers. So we have one example of the Australia ASEAN-New Zealand Free Trade Agreement, where there's an economic cooperation element, but that's mainly based on capacity building. And Australia put a lot of funding into competition policy, reform and capacity building in ASEAN. Well, in RCEP, it's going to go much more beyond that, and it should be an experience sharing economic cooperation agenda. And that framework is going to help countries to build understanding, but also trust between countries as we move forward. So that's not yet fully defined from my understanding. It's an open area for countries and members to define, but that's an area where, of course, it'll go beyond the official process to where business, like in APEC, like in other processes, and academia and think tank world to engage. And I hope that's an active area that could see a lot of the gains from this agreement come on stream. So I might leave it there, and I look forward very much to the questions. Thank you.
Terrific. Thank you, Shiro. And once again, guys, get your questions, pop it into the WebEx system. So up next, we've got Leonie Ferretter from KPMG. Leonie's the head of trade and customs for Asia Pacific for KPMG in Australia. Leonie's got a lot of years of experience in import and export regulatory environments, customs, excise, logistics, project management. So very much on the supply chain side and on the goods trade side. Leonie's got a huge amount of experience. KPMG, terrific partner of ours at AustCham. So Leona, I will hand over to you, and Christian, I'm sure, will get the PPT up in T-minus 10 seconds. Over to you, Leonie.
Thanks, Nick, and thanks for not mentioning the number of years of experience I have. So we can move on to the next slide.
Always polite.
Okay, so as Nick's pointed out, I practice in the international trade space, and our work is around advising clients on all matters of trade and customs across the region and indeed globally. And of course, free trade agreements is part of the work that we do on a very, very regular basis. So the minute the RCEP was signed, the phones were running hot right across the KPMG offices in our trade teams saying, okay, the RCEP's here, how can we benefit from it? What's the deal under the RCEP, and what's going to change in our world? So as Kevin alluded to, some of the aspects of RCEP which are really positive for businesses who are dealing with our noodle bowl of free trade agreements across the region is this standardization of rules. So, I mean, currently, as Kevin's slide pointed out, we have a number of bilateral and indeed multilateral trade agreements that the Australian businesses and businesses across the region are trying to access. If you're exporting to multiple countries, you're doing any number of free trade agreement qualifications and needing to get documentation under various scenarios. So you may need a certificate of origin, for example, under the ASEAN Australia Free Trade Agreement. But if you're going to ship to Malaysia using the Malaysia Australia Free Trade Agreement, you can just issue a declaration. So what this agreement is doing is allowing us to look at these single set of rules for businesses and say, okay, can we apply one agreement right across our region to the benefit of our business? So a single sets of rules of origin, yes, that's fantastic. With the volume of FTAs that we're currently assessing, it would be great just to look at one. The other standardisation is the rules of consignment. So what that essentially means is how you ship goods to and through countries and what those requirements are, because all of our existing free trade agreements have slight variation. Another benefit for those multinationals who deal with various aspects of trade across the region is very clear third-party invoicing provision. So essentially what that means is you may be the exporter, but you might have another party invoicing. There have been some difficulties with third-party invoicing in some of our older free trade agreements. So this is a bonus as well. The certificate of origin and documentation requirements, single free trade agreement. Now, just bearing in mind that some countries will still require the issuance of a certificate of origin under the RCEP once it's implemented. They have a phasing in period, and primarily because in those countries they're not used to seeing a declaration of origin. They're more used to seeing a certificate. And so some countries will phase in the allowance for a declaration rather than a professional, just a straight declaration from a manufacturer or exporter. And the big one, and the really big one, of course, is what we call accumulation. So Kevin alluded to that before. It's really about leveraging the value chains that we have in our region that allows us to potentially access more markets when we're using multiple inputs to manufacture from our region. So an example of accumulation would be if I'm manufacturing a motor in Vietnam and I have components come from China and Japan and Korea and Australia and Indonesia, all of the value of those goods can go into the calculation of a good being able to be eligible for preferential duty rates. So that's a really big positive step with a big regional agreement. And the big ones, that are in here are the inclusion of China, Japan, and Korea, of course, in addition to ASEAN. So we think that from a client perspective, with regional value chains, the accumulation aspects of the agreement will provide great benefit for this region. So Christian, I might ask you to move to the next slide, because here's where the rubber hits the road with these free trade agreements. I noticed in the LinkedIn comments when this article advertisement went out, interested in seeing what's the difference between chapter and RCEP. So those of you who are dealing with free trade agreements would know that every single product has an individual rule of origin, and every single product has its own variation on phasing duty rates. So I've picked a very simple product here. I've picked a polyethylene product that could be shipped across the region. And just to demonstrate why it's important to really think about what free trade agreements you're going to use for your goods, we can see here that this product, this polyethylene, under the RCEP, if it was exported from China and imported into Australia in year one of RCEP, so once it commences, the duty rate would remain at 5%. And indeed, the duty rate wouldn't start phasing under the RCEP until year 15. So that's down to 3%. And in 20 years' time, it would become duty-free under the RCEP. If we were shipping the same product from Australia to China, manufactured in Australia, imported into China, there's an MFN rate of 6.5%. And China, for this specific product for Australia, has unbound. So what does that mean? It means that there's no reduction in duty rate if we're using the RCEP for this product. So as manufacturers and exporters, what we need to then do is say, well, actually, what other agreements do we have in place? And, you know, the chapter has actually been in place for a number of years now. So if we're just talking about China and Australia, if we look at the chapter, both of the countries now in year 5 have zero duty rate. So I use this slide as a really good illustration to say, if you're dealing with China, yes, the RCEP's important, but don't forget, if you do have access under an existing agreement, you may not get an immediate or as great a benefit under the RCEP as you have under current agreements. Christian, could you go to the next slide, please? I think this is also a really interesting example. Fantastic. So my Korean colleagues prepared this for me, and it's another example of how the RCEP is going to vary across the region. So each of the countries in our region have negotiated these individual duty rates for various countries. So if we were looking at the Korean market, for example, and we were importing food supplements, our duty rates start phasing straight away in year 1. And for ASEAN, Australia and New Zealand. However, if we were importing food supplements into Korea from China or Japan, there is no concession given to this. And so this, looking at individual products and the way that they phase over the number of years actually becomes quite a complex process. It really highlights for our clients the need to look at bringing RCEP into your business at a short, medium and long-term proposition, and also to make sure that you do your due diligence in terms of understanding when you will get a benefit from RCEP, because as we pointed out on the previous slide, some of the concessional rates are not available until 20 years' time. And in some instances, there have been no concessions given. Christian, would you mind moving to the next slide, please? Okay, so what are we saying to our clients? We're really asking our clients to take a strategic look at the RCEP, as I've just said. It's probably not going to be implemented for, let's say earliest 6 months. Kevin can correct me if I'm wrong there, but some of the commentators are saying 6 months to 2 years before RCEP comes into place. That's not necessarily a bad thing, because it actually gives organisations time to plan. And the things that organisations need to be looking at is actually a proper overview of how the RCEP impacts your operations, your business performance, and also your competitiveness in the APAC region. So when you look at your business performance and competitiveness, you need to also look at not just existing markets, but how will RCEP play into your future markets? Are there opportunities for you to strategically locate facilities that will allow you to access the RCEP? But in doing so, what are the customs duty benefits? Are they immediate? Are they going to occur in 5 years, or will they be 20 years down the track? And if they're 20 years down the track, you might actually look at a different way to leverage the RCEP or continue to access the individual free trade agreements, multilateral and bilateral agreements that we currently have. And then your supply chain network and your product flows are also important. So this goes back to the issue around accumulation. Can you change your source of supply to benefit from the RCEP, where you understand that your final product will get a customs duty benefit? And what does that look like? And that requires many parts of your business to actually work together. So you need your trade teams to be working with your supply chain teams, to be working with your operations teams and your strategy teams in order to understand how the RCEP will actually fully benefit your organisation. And then once you've made a decision around how you're going to access the RCEP and what benefits it will give you, then you need to consider those individual rules of origin, the certificate of origin, the transportation, so the consignment rules, and if they actually prohibit some kind of change for your business. So certainly it's a complex agreement. It does have some great benefits, but we are saying to our clients, you need to look at this properly, because it's not going to be an immediate panacea for all of the free trade agreement woes that we have across the region. So I'm going to pause there and Nick, pass back to you, because I think it would be great if we could have time to deal with questions.
You online there, Nick? I can't hear anything.
Oh, yeah, it's always best if you hit the mute button, I find. Trick for young players there, is that right? Yeah. Sorry, Leonie. I had a great question too. The question I had for you was, when you are talking to clients, have you got a sense of how prepared they are for RCEP? Or because I get the sense, certainly over here in China, that there's a degree of mystery there.
Yeah, there is, and it's not a matter of preparedness. It's a matter of, I think, like most free trade agreements, there's always a lot of discussion around how we've got a free trade agreement. There's going to be all this benefit under the agreement, and then you get into the detail, okay? And so I think what a lot of organisations are surprised about are the very complex underlying rules, phasing rates, phasing documentation requirements for countries. I don't think that the organisations that we've spoken to have been prepared for that and realise the volume of work that needs to be done in order to actually access the agreement, and understanding they may not get an immediate benefit, so they might be better off actually using the agreements that they're currently using.
Right. Kevin, from your perspective, have you heard much?
Well, I think most of we've received a lot of interest from different business chambers on what's in RCEP. So this isn't the first presentation on RCEP that I've given. And my view is quite China-centric. So it really comes down a lot to which businesses that you're speaking to, the level of interest. As we saw in that matrix at the start, that the Japan, I don't know if you can bring up the...
We can. 1 second.
The slide that I had at the start.
That we can do.
Yeah. If you look at the matrix there, you can see a lot of white blanks between China, Japan, and Korea. I think there's a lot of interest, given that there are no existing FTAs between those three countries. If people that have businesses involving those three are quite interested, that would be my observation. It depends on the business.
Right.
I think Kevin's right. I'll just jump in there. I think Kevin's right. There's a huge amount of interest in the Japan, China, Korea, those three countries, and how you can leverage that. That's where we're seeing the most interest, and particularly Japan and China.
Okay. Because you're probably businesses up here that we see that work in those spaces. Agriculture is a big one.
Yeah.
That are operating in those three spaces. But, how integrated the supply chains are between those three countries, I don't know. But
I'd add one other observation is that China's, I think I pointed this out at the start of my little talk, that China's, the state media here has talked up the deal quite a lot, just in terms of its scale, in terms of its significance. And if you're asking about what's of interest we're seeing beyond companies, we are getting approached by a lot of other embassies, particularly from Europe, expressing interest in the deal because they've seen all this fanfare around it and they're worried that their exporters are missing out and that they don't know the detail and they're curious to find out more. So that's another interesting thing that we've...
Right. Well, looking for what Europeans and others may be looking to do a deal with the RCEP countries, or looking to do something similar here.
I think it's a bit premature at the moment, just because we still have to go through this ratification stage, and the different processes in different countries will means that it's when we get to that point of six members and six ASEAN members and 3 non-ASEANs having ratified, it's probably more likely towards the end of the year or even next year when we can achieve that. So the idea of another member joining at this stage is probably... The agreement is structured so that others can join. It's an open agreement, but it's probably premature at this stage given it's not ratified. But there is interest in what's in the deal, are we missing out, and at some future point, can we join? But it's all very early. It's all just an information gathering exercise at the moment, not a serious intention.
And on that implementation, I think Leonie mentioned sort of 6 months. What are you hearing in terms of, or longer? What are you hearing in terms of implementation?
So we've heard from a number of other countries that they're similarly ambitious to us, trying to implement it as fast as they can. So China's an example where they want to bring ratification about within the first half of this year. That's the ambition. As I said before, the difficulty is going to be we've got a variety of ratification processes across the membership. Different members of the agreement have been... We're still living in this COVID environment, so different members of the agreement have been disrupted in different ways. So I think the expectation is sort of by the end of the year would be a very... an ambitious time to achieve it. Right.
And I've got a question coming in here from Michael, and not to address to anyone in particular, so I'll throw it open. If you had to name the top industries that benefit from RCEP, what would they be? Who wants to go first? Shiro, you've been quiet.
Well, look, I'm not going to pick industries. I think it's just important to realize, as you mentioned, a lot of interest in the Japan, China, Korea relationship, that Northeast Asia economy, and to understand that it's already fairly highly integrated economically, more than you'd expect, given there's no real economic agreement that binds them together. And to remember that Japan's the largest source of foreign investment in China, mainland China, after Taiwan and Hong Kong, of course, much larger than the United States. And so this idea of decoupling the US and China's economy, if that wasn't unrealistic enough, putting pressure on US allies like Japan and Australia to possibly try to decouple from the Chinese economy or put sort of strategic or geopolitical interests first, I think that's going to be a mistake. So what this agreement's going to do is, I think we've all three of us have alluded to, is deepen the global value chains in East Asia. And China's going to be central to that. All the talk of trade diversification, too dependent on the Chinese economy, that's not going to change anytime soon. In fact, I expect it to deepen. China's going to become more important for all our economies. So, I think that's the bigger picture, and thinking about the fact that these economies are not going to decouple with the Chinese economy, and RCEP is moving in the opposite direction of decoupling. Then you have to think about, well, what sectors are going to flourish under more simple rules of origin, not just autos and electronics, but we're talking about higher value add production now across China, and supply chains that are going to reach further into Southeast Asia as a result. So look, I'll let the others pick sectors, but I think just having that broader context in mind is probably pretty helpful.
Leonie, have you got any thoughts before I come to you, Leonie? Just quickly, guys, if you're not talking, can you just mute your end? I just had a couple of people mention typing and feedback. I don't know if that was my end, but over to you, Leonie, or Kevin, have you got thoughts?
Not from me. I mean, we haven't done any really in-depth analysis other than client-specific areas. So I think I'd leave to Kevin to kind of talk about the benefits for China and Australia.
Kev?
Yeah, look, I again, like Leonie, haven't seen particular analysis that would give me a definitive answer, but speculating, I would say if you are participating in a value chain, so most likely some component of manufacturing that is spanning the region, you will probably benefit either directly through some form of tariff reduction, or there could be a flow-on benefit from smoothing that value chain process through the different countries, and the reduced tariff imposition on other countries, that the benefits of that may flow down to you if you're participating in part of the supply chain, even if you're not the direct recipient of those benefits. Just in terms of reduced business costs, reduced tariffs, the benefits will likely spill down to you as well. From an Australian perspective, as I pointed out at the start, we already have free trade agreements with all of the countries participating. We don't see substantive gains in terms of like specific tariff reductions for Australia, but we already have the same or better under Chapter. So probably the biggest beneficiaries from Australian perspective are service providers in some of the industries that were on my slide earlier, who gain some incremental certainty around their operations and investments in China. Okay,
I've got a question from Alfredo Sanchez to Leonie. You just talked about RCEP. RCEPs are preferential tariffs not applying equally to products across all countries. Could you expand on some of the reasons for this? And does this not counter the notion that RCEP's key advantage is harmonisation?
Thanks for that question. Yes,
I think this might have been a former KPMG employee.
No. But it's a really good point, right? And I'm not a free trade agreement negotiator, because if I'd been there, I would have been pushing for everyone to come to an agreement. But I suspect that, and Kevin, you might have been part of this process or understand the process better than I do. In order to get an agreement across the line of this magnitude, for everyone to reach an agreement on tariffs for every single country in that's participating in this agreement, the deal would never have been done. So there's a lot of areas where our regional neighbours compete, and you know, they might well have just said, you know, in order to get this deal across the line, we will give the concessions to these countries, but we're not going to give them to these countries because it's too much competition, or it would not be of benefit to our country. I suspect that's what happens. It is really disappointing as an outcome, I agree, but that's part of the process that we have to deal with on implementation.
Kevin, Shiro, thoughts?
I didn't participate in the negotiation of RCEP, but I have participated in other free trade agreement negotiations, and I guess this is sort of a way of concurring with Leonie that these negotiations take place over a number of rounds in which you have offers and then responses and counter offers, and so and part of that process is trying to, particularly for a country like Australia, to lift the ambition of others and to argue people's offers up. And as Leonie pointed out, there's a trade-off ultimately between trying to get the most ambition that you can out of your counterparts and a sort of uniformity of what's on offer. And as I pointed out earlier in my talk, one of our goals for these arrangements is to maximize the tariff reductions that we can achieve. So that, in some cases, attempting to argue people up and maximize those tariff reductions comes at the cost of uniformity across all of the countries.
Shiro, any thoughts?
Yeah, look, I might just add, I don't know what it's like really on the ground there, but when we're talking about margins where tariffs are 3% versus 4% versus 5%, they're pretty low, right? I know it's complicated when you've got goods crossing borders multiple times, but look, from all the surveys I've seen, businesses usually ignore the preference margins and just trade under what the MFN, the WTO tariffs are, when the preferences aren't that much lower. So yes, we want uniform. I think it's important to get them uniform at zero. And I think that's the mission over time, to get them to reduce to zero unilaterally without even having to negotiate. And I think that's where, importantly, this economic cooperation agenda can build momentum over time and have some confidence do that. Most of the tariff reductions in our region over the last 30 years have happened unilaterally, you know, including Australia, Japan, a lot of Southeast Asian countries, in the APEC kind of framework, you know, agreeing that it's in your own benefit as a country to open up trade and investment to other countries, and unilaterally reducing tariffs. So I think, you know, they're already pretty low, right? They're either 5% in Australia or zero. I think it's keeping that in mind, continuing towards zero.
Okay, and I've got a follow-up too, Shiro, for you. This comes from Mike Wadley. Is there great significance in having China, Korea, and Japan in the same agreement beyond simply being historic, or is that something which awaits implementation?
Look, it is important. The three have committed. I see no reason why they won't implement. There's actually a parallel process going on between the three of them, a trilateral process, China, Japan, and South Korea. And they've got a kind of a weak investment agreement between them, and China and Korea have a free trade agreement between them. But, you know, it is historically important, and the problem with the three countries is they've got a lot of historical baggage and lack of trust. I mean, you look at the Australia-China relationship now, that's in a trough. Japan and China's been there. China and South Korea's been there. And Japan and South Korea are currently there now with their relationship at the lowest point since normalization in 1965. These are difficult, relationships geopolitically, but they move ahead economically. And I think that's where these governments, encouraged by the business sector, sees that economic relationships and deepening economic integration helps them manage the politics. So I see no reason why this won't proceed for the three. In fact, there's talk of, on the back of RCEP, doing a deeper trilateral agreement, and that might take a few years. But I think that's the kind of thing that should be encouraged and should be brought into the RCEP process. So it's not just the three countries being more inward-looking and having concessions only to themselves, but doing what the European-China Investment Agreement did, which was make concessions that are open to other countries too. So on MFN, most favoured nation basis. So look, I think the countries are moving in the right direction. I think that's the most significant part of this agreement for me, the Japan-China link, if you think about bilateral relationships. But I think that's where, next cab off the rank is going to have to be India, and trying to bring India into these East Asian value chains.
And Leonie, thanks, Shiro. And Leonie, another one came in asking specifically whether semiconductors are dealt with, whether they're specifically dealt with under RCEP.
Well, they will be, because they'll have a tariff classification, and that tariff classification will have a product-specific rule. But as to how they're dealt with, what their specific rules are and what their phasing rates of duty are, I don't know the answer to that, because there's many, many hundreds of thousands of products that are covered by the RCEP. So to find that out, you will need to look at the tariff classification of the product, and from there, look at the rule, and then look at what the phasing rates of the schedules of each of the countries in the RCEP have said against that tariff classification. So it's quite a process even for one product. Sorry, but I don't know the answer.
Okay, no worries. And this a question from Daz. How does RCEP, fit in terms of compatibility with BRI, with Belt and Road? Anyone want to have a stab at that? Come on, Kev, you've got BRI in your eyes, I can tell.
So I guess conceptually they sit as separate initiatives. So in a sense, as Shiro was pointing out at the start, RCEP is an ASEAN-led initiative that is a free trade agreement. And yeah, I agree with his characterization that there is this sort of myth around that it is a Chinese-led agreement. Whereas Belt and Road is sort of a cluster of, a sort of an umbrella under which a series of investments going out from China are sort of brought under a common narrative. Now, yeah, so in that regard, I would argue that they're separate things, but to the extent that RCEP, and I mentioned that the members made negative list commitments on investment in the agreement, I guess you can argue to the extent that China achieves liberalization in elements of this to various investment regimes in the region under the agreement, and to the extent that it secures investment protections under the investment chapter that it didn't previously have, it could help facilitate Chinese investment in different countries in the region. I suspect it would be at the margin, but I would have to actually go through and do a detailed analysis to try.
Sure. Sure. Well, look, guys, we're coming up on 2 o'clock back in Eastern States of Australia and 11 o'clock here. I did say 1 hour, so we're coming up on 1 hour. What I reckon we might do is we might pause it here, and I think it'd be a really good thing to sort of come back and continue this conversation once the implementation phase starts, I think that might be a sort of a good point, whether that's in 6 months, 9 months, to sort of come back and revisit and do an update as to where we're at with RCEP. So look, I'll thank everyone. I'll thank Shiro down in Canberra for his time. Leonie, I know you're an exceptionally busy person, so thank you. And Kevin, I know the Chinese government are keeping you very busy, so thank you. And thanks to everyone for jumping on. Again, this, I'll have a link up and we'll send this out. We started, I think, a couple of minutes late, so all people missed was me crapping on. So all the important stuff was covered and recorded. So we'll have that on our website, and I'll distribute that around. But everyone have a terrific rest of your Thursday back in Australia and throughout the region. And bye-bye from Beijing.
Thanks a lot, everyone. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Shiro. Thanks, Leonie. Thanks all.